recording is now 2 layers deep on the menu, so we can't even do it with one button push in Zoom anymore.
So, where we left off, I actually said Acts 16 in my email. I'll get them straight one of these days. We're actually left off in Acts 15, starting at verse 22. And last week, we learned, we talked about the Orthodox police came to Antioch. Paul and Barnabas were in Antioch, and some other believers came up to Antioch to preach the necessity for circumcision. And I just said Peter, Paul and Barnabas. And Paul, of course, was preaching that circumcision was not necessary. Barnabas fell back and started to wimp out on it, so did Peter. Anyhow, they were all called back to Jerusalem for the Council of Jerusalem, where there was basically a debate, and it was decided that circumcision was not necessary for Gentiles to have. And James wrote a letter. That's where we left off, and I'll give it to you.
So today there's something that comes up that seems to be a big inconsistency. And as it happens, Malcolm wrote us last night. We said write in questions in advance, and I already had notes to talk about this, but it seems inconsistent. And I had already planned to talk about this. To understand it, we've kind of got to draw some stuff together from multiple weeks. So I want to go back. If you remember when Paul and Barnabas are in Lystra, and they perform a miracle, God performs a miracle through Paul, and they begin to try and worship them. They say that Zeus and Hermes have come down. And what you notice, if you look, the way Paul talks when he's in a synagogue, the terms that he uses, he talks about the Torah, the prophets, prophecies on Messiah, because they understand it. But when he's with these people, this sort of mob in Lystra, it wouldn't do any good for him to talk about Jesus, about Messiah, in terms of old Hebrew writings, because they don't know anything about it. And so he has to change his approach. He has to talk differently. And I got one of the quotes here. He talks to them about God gives you the rain from heaven and the fruitful seasons, filling your hearts with food and gladness. And so he has to use different terms, different methods to communicate with people. And it's not hypocritical, it's not inconsistent. It is the way we must communicate with people. John, at the beginning of his gospel, begins, we know in the beginning was the Word, but it's actually logos. In the beginning was the logos, and it is this Greek term, this Greek idea. That's one way we know he's talking to a Greek audience. So we adjust. We do it when we talk about anything, but when we share the gospel, we have to be willing to meet people on their terms, use language, use things that they can understand. And we see Paul doing that, especially there in Lystra. But that's going to become important to the other things that we're going to talk about. And it's hard because some of this is separated in different chapters. And so, not wanting to bounce around, briefly, I'm going to skip ahead, because in order for this to make sense, I have to. When they came from Jerusalem and told the new Gentile believers, you have to get circumcised. That's what we talked about last week. The people in Jerusalem, they had a big council, and they sent a letter to those Gentile believers and said, we're sorry. We're sorry we did this. We didn't mean to upset you. You don't have to get circumcised. What you do have to do is refrain from eating meat sacrificed to idols, eating meat that's, from animals that have been strangled, etc. They put still these other rules on them. Paul will later in Romans write about meat sacrificed to idols. And what he says is, an idol is nothing. An idol is stone and wood. And sacrificing meat to an idol doesn't taint the meat. It's okay. But if you have believers who are less mature, who are weak, and if you eating meat, because what happened was people began to get afraid. They said, oh, we can't eat meat at all because there's a chance it might have been sacrificed to an idol. And people today, we do these things. We start inventing our own doctrine. But this is what was happening. And so Paul writes, and he says, look, there's nothing wrong with eating meat. There's nothing wrong if it's been sacrificed to an idol. But if by doing that you cause someone else to fall away, if you present a stumbling block, don't eat meat. Refrain for their sake. To me, that's one of the hardest lessons in the Bible. It's right there with turn the other cheek. And it's a form of turn the other cheek, I guess, because for one thing, I'm not giving up meat. But the other thing is for us to give up something important to us that really is not, if you want a sin, it's not offensive to God, but we have to do it to keep from being a stumbling block. We're going to have in the next chapter, Paul is going to take someone named Timothy with him on a missionary journey. And I'm skipping ahead because all these things have to be tied together. Before they leave, Timothy is the son of a Greek father and a Jewish mother. And before they leave, Paul circumcises Timothy. And we look at that and we go, wait a minute, didn't we just have this big to-do about how people don't have to be circumcised to be believers? Yes. And it seems like an inconsistency, and I don't believe that it is. But what's important to Paul, you can see from those examples, is that for Paul, the important thing is that he share the gospel in a way that people believe it. All right? Timothy, being the son of a Greek father and a Jewish mother, one of the things we learned while we were in Israel is, what makes you a Jew? And the primary thing that makes you a Jew is to have a Jewish mother. Not a Jewish father, a Jewish mother. And so Timothy is going to be viewed as a Jew by the other Jewish people that they go and speak with. He's going to be viewed as a Jew because he has a Jewish mother, but he's going to be viewed as an unreliable, uncircumcised Jew. And they won't listen to him. And so what's important to Paul is that Timothy's not being circumcised doesn't wind up being a stumbling block for the other Jews that they're going to go share the gospel with. Someone we listened to this week said if Timothy had been a Gentile, Paul would have never insisted on that. And I think it's true because we've already established it's not necessary. It's not something God was putting on them that says, for you to be a believer, you must be circumcised. But what Paul knows is that he's going out, he and Timothy are going to go share the gospel. And if he brings this uncircumcised Jew, they're going to turn him off. They're not going to listen. And that's the thing that we need to keep in mind about Paul this whole time. Nothing is more important to Paul than sharing the gospel in a way it can be believed. There's a point where he says he was with people, and as he's leaving, he says, when I came to you, I determined to know nothing but Jesus, Christ and him crucified. It's the only thing I made up my mind. I was not going to get into all of these big wild things. One thing and one thing only. This is Paul. And Paul gets presented as rigid. He's really not rigid. He is single-minded. So when we come to that today, or if you read ahead and you see we've just studied how there was this big almost split, but there's this big argument over whether or not these Gentiles have to be circumcised. And then he's taken Timothy with him, and the first thing he does is circumcise him. And it reads like he did it himself, and that's right up there with giving up meat. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that for anybody. But it appears that he did this himself, but he did it for one reason, and it's Paul's consistent focus is that I don't want to present a stumbling block to anybody that keeps them from believing. So, sorry, we can go back to the...
Well, and now it'll make sense. So we're in Acts 15, verse 22. And like I said, James, who was Jesus' half-brother and was the leader of the church in Jerusalem, wrote this letter. And that's how we left it, that we left the end of the letter in verse 21. Then the apostles and elders with the whole church decided to select men from among them to send to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. They chose Judas, called Barsabbas, and Silas, 2 leaders among the brothers, and sent them with this letter. The apostles and the elders, your brothers, to the brothers among the Gentiles in Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia. Greetings. It has come to our attention that some went out from us without our authorization and unsettled you, troubling your minds by what they said. So we all agreed to choose men to send to you along with our beloved Barnabas and Paul, men who have risked their lives for the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, we are sending Judas and Silas to tell you in person the same thing we're writing. It seems good to the Holy Spirit and to us not to burden you with anything beyond these essential requirements. You must abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. You will do well to avoid these things. Farewell. So the men went off and went down to Antioch, where they assembled the congregation and delivered the letter. When the people read it, they rejoiced at its encouraging message. Judas and Silas, who themselves were prophets, said much to encourage and strengthen the brothers. After spending some time there, they were sent off by the brothers in peace to return to those who had sent them. But Paul and Barnabas remained at Antioch along with many others, teaching and preaching the word of the Lord.
So last week we had some refer to it as the Jerusalem Council. And these people get together, and one thing I will, sort of caution, there have been these councils where they sit down to determine, to decide what's God's will. Instead of to seek it, they sit down and try and decide what God wants. And it may seem like a subtle difference, but it's not. But they come to the conclusion, okay, they don't have to be circumcised. And they sent 2 representatives from Jerusalem with this letter. And
Along with Paul.
And you wonder, why not just Paul and Barnabas? And it is, this thing has already begun where the church is beginning to become official, and they have to send official representatives from the church at Jerusalem in order for it to be official when the letter reaches these people. I can't find any other way to interpret that. They had to make sure they have our authority. These are our representatives. Paul and Barnabas were not. And so they bring this letter, and it says, as Mary just read, we have determined you really don't have to be circumcised. You don't have to become Jews, but you have to do this and this and this. And I'm not saying those are bad things, but those things didn't stand in the way of these people believing and receiving forgiveness and redemption from sins. But they deliver the letter, and it says that these Gentile believers rejoice. You can imagine that's good news, because if they had gone the other route, it would have meant that their faith and baptism didn't mean anything. And so they rejoice, and these people do stay, though. The 2 that they send, Barsabbas and Silas, and stayed with the people and strengthened them. And that, I think, is an exceptionally good model. We've already seen Barnabas do that. Paul gives his life to it. But these guys come over and stay with this church for a while, strengthening them, teaching them for a fairly good while. So, it all comes out in the end pretty well.
And then they go back to, Judas and Silas go back to Jerusalem, and Paul and Barnabas stay in Antioch.
Right.
And during this time, we read some things this week. Remember, this is the end of his first missionary trip that they believe lasted probably a year to 2 years. And he has already he wrote the letter to the Galatians during this time, and he's already troubled that he went to Galatia, to all those cities up there, and then things started to fall apart. And so he had to write a letter to encouragement. And there's a belief that he did change his model a little bit here to stay longer with a new church to make sure that everything, that they taught them enough that they could go on themselves. Is that a...
Yeah, no, it's new believers often, well, not often, I guess probably always, there's more that needs to be taught. And Paul had a good habit when these churches are founded. He doesn't just leave them alone. He looks in on them, and we're going to see he revisits, but he also writes these letters because they have a lot to learn.
So we're starting the...
Is that because at Galatia and Derbe and these first trip, they're not Jewish, and they have no Old Testament repertoire?
The Old Testament reinforces. Well, I'll give you one example. The Old Testament does reinforce, and by seeing all the prophecies, all the history, and there are things about the law. Go back to the Ten Commandments. That's just a good way to live. And there literally are people who don't understand why. And one example of this is in a lot of these pagan temples, they had temple prostitutes. They stayed on duty 24 hours a day. And when you've grown up seeing that as part of life, it's just normal. We know that what we get through the scriptures, and in fact in this letter that they send from Jerusalem, is to avoid sexual immorality. Well, there are people who literally think, why would you avoid that? I don't understand. And they need to be taught. They need to understand what it is, that it's not just someone looking to control how you behave. There are also benefits, this life more abundant. And if people are not used to thinking that way, there's some education. And we take a lot for granted. I can tell you that when we teach, when there's someone who's never been in church before in their life, and we've had some of those, you have to adjust. There are things that some people look at, and I've been told that a lot of the time, inner city people who've grown up in this sort of more confrontational manner, they have to be taught that it really is inherently bad to steal. It's not just something that's bad if you get caught. It's inherently bad. Well, no, but it's true that people don't think that way. And so it is a thing that there is a lot of teaching and in a lot of areas that needs to go on.
But there were competing philosophies, multiple philosophies going on at the same time.
Multiple philosophies, yeah.
Not only Jews, but, Greek.
Right.
Yeah, everything. So if I'm out there in the boondocks, so to speak, out of Jerusalem, Paul is going to have to teach in words that get there and learn the lesson that is the way.
The way is an important thing. One of the things when I talk about teaching, one of the good places to look is in our New Testament, we have the convenience of having red letters. We look back to the words that Jesus spoke, and if these people are unfamiliar with it, there's a lot of teaching there. I mentioned a while ago, and this is probably worth talking about, that John begins his gospel, in the beginning was the Logos. Now, when you mentioned philosophy, Logos is a part of Greek philosophy. It's where we get our word logic. It's where we get things like biology, sociology, all the ologies comes from logic. It comes from the word logos. And the Greeks had this idea that there is something, this underlying logic that ties everything together, that makes it all make sense, that's under the foundations of the entire world. And John is speaking to a Greek audience, and he's got to talk to them in terms they'll understand. So he says, yes, in the very beginning was the Logos. And the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And then he goes on to say the Logos became flesh. So those of us who know this are familiar with the idea. He is saying that this concept that you have of something that's responsible for everything and ties it together is Messiah. It's Jesus. And so he uses terms that they know and then brings them around to understand that he was there at the beginning. He was part of the creation. So when you talk about, are there different philosophies, it is really important to separate philosophy, though, from gospel. There is a truth. There is an underlying truth. And that philosophy is how we feel about it. And so now in school, they teach math. They were already doing it when our kids were in school. They don't want to just teach math. They want to ask the kids, how do you feel about it? Well, it's really immaterial how you feel about it. Math, the rules of math work regardless of how you feel about them. And that's sort of what they did with, I loosely saying religion, but philosophy gets more into, well, I don't like the idea that God would do that, therefore he doesn't. And I hear this a lot because I get out and kind of crawl through the weeds. I read people often make the comment, I refuse to believe in any God who would allow this to happen. What's going on in Afghanistan? I refuse to believe in any God who would allow that to happen. And that's philosophy. That's not truth, and we'll talk more about it. We started this on what's to be taught. There is much to be taught, particularly to these Gentiles who have learned to accept certain things that are not consistent with what they've been taught in Scripture.
One of the things that hit me from today's Christians, there's different denominations or Christians in all over the place that believe they are just New Testament Christians, and so they just concentrate on the New Testament. And I mean, what you can learn and what's so important, and the reason we go and do something from the New Testament and then go back to the Old Testament, is there's just a lot for us to learn.
That reinforces,
That
yeah.
reinforces.
Malcolm had
Yes.
something there. Yes, sir.
Circumcision again.
Oh, boy.
Just got to ask you a question. Does circumcising the Jews do them any good whatsoever in the sight of God? I mean, it's not just Gentiles that should not be circumcised. What good if I was a Jew and was converted by the preaching of Paul? Would it then be good and proper for me to be circumcised?
Okay, so like a Jewish believer today, does the circumcision make any difference? And there's the distinction about the law, and it's easy to go back to the original 10. Those are great ways to live. That we know that behaving that way, we're taught, is pleasing to God. I don't think there's anything wrong with the circumcision itself, as long as you don't use that to replace the need for the sacrifice that Jesus made. If it's something that you feel like is important, Paul teaches conscience a lot. The thing about not eating meat, he says, if eating meat troubles your conscience, don't do it. And he goes far enough to say, if it troubles someone else's conscience, don't do it. I don't absolutely have any thought of telling someone who's a Jew, you shouldn't even you shouldn't get circumcised, you shouldn't do this, as long as they don't use it to supplant, to try and obviate the need for the sacrifice, for the atonement that Jesus brought, it's all good. We lose sight of that Paul tells us very explicitly, all things are okay, all things are available, but not all things are profitable. Not all things are expedient. Not all things help us. And so there are people who think that consuming any alcohol is a horrible thing. And Paul would say, don't be a stumbling block to them. But like everything else, it's not the consumption. If you believe that by abstaining, you can somehow justify yourself, you've moved over into legalism. That by abstaining, I can somehow draw myself to God by this. No, the idea is that we seek ways to live that are pleasing to God. And it is an important, it's not even that subtle to me, but it's an important distinction. Do I think it does any good? It depends on what you mean by good. I mean, if they feel like they're doing something pleasing to God, I think they should absolutely do it. If they think that by doing something pleasing to God, they justify themselves and bring themselves, that's misguided. That's what I think. But that's,
In the olden days, when was that baby circumcised?
8th day.
8th day, kind of like the Catholic practice of baptizing was responsible.
The 8th day, except when it wasn't. And the ones who were circumcised on the 8th day were better Jews. They could brag about it. It's like so many things. It's all sort of fluid.
So that's obviously not by consent of child.
I think that's fair to say.
Now that answers your question, with the child circumcised, he's not even a participant.
Go ahead.
But we're going to get into a phrase here about you're saved and your household is saved.
We'll get to that when we get to it, but it's on the notes.
Yeah, I don't know what
It's on the notes. I'll deal with it.
Okay, so we are about to start the second missionary trip, and I'm going to show you, I'm going to share a map with you. And
But real quick, we've realized we're not on the other end of this Zoom thing. And for us, this map is gigantic. For you, it looks like a little bitty box. There's a way you can pin
Change
it
the view.
and change the view. And I have looked and looked. We can't do that for you. We can't make it giant size. So I apologize to those of you on Zoom.
so this is the second missionary trip, and it has, well, I guess Silas started in Jerusalem. They all met in Antioch. So they're going to Antioch. And you will see a lot of these cities. I will pull this up a couple of times because there's just so many cities that they go to. But they go, remember, Galatia, so they're going to go back towards some of the cities they've been to already. There's the other Antioch that we've talked about before. And then after that, they're going to go to new places, okay? Anything else you want to say about that?
No, it's a big, long journey. We always talk about how they travel. This is an incredibly long journey.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Can do this, there we go. Okay, so I am on Acts 15, verse 36. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the brothers in every town where we proclaim the word of the Lord to see how they are doing." Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, but Paul thought it best not to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not accompanied them in the work. Their disagreement was so sharp that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. And he traveled through Syria and Sicily, strengthening the churches.
So as happens, there's a lot in just a few verses. One of the things I love is they're up in Antioch, and Paul says to Barnabas, let's go back to all of these places where we brought the gospel already, where we started these, small churches, if you will. Let's go revisit them. And you remember they had people looking to kill them in every one of those places. Paul got stoned and drug out of town, left for dead. But let's go back to them. And this goes to what you and I were just discussing. Paul sees this need to go back and check in on them. And I think it's a marvelous thing. Too often, and I say these things not to condemn, but because if we don't learn for our own lives, how should we behave? We've missed the point. But Paul doesn't say, okay, well, you believed, you were baptized, I'm done with you. You're on your own. Paul continues to look in and teach and strengthen. So he says, hey, let's go back to all these places. And Barnabas was up for it, but he wants to bring John Mark along. And John Mark, you remember, left him. He's a kid. And he got off on that first missionary journey, went a little ways, and he said, I'm going home to mom. We think of these people in the Bible as almost icons, almost like not real. They're all perfect. And here we see, over whether or not to bring John Mark, we see these two, legends of the New Testament get into an argument and split because Paul says we can't depend on him. You remember that time he abandoned us? He went back home. He's not worthy. He's weak. He won't be there when we need him. I'm not bringing him. And Barnabas is, remember, Barnabas is the son of encouragement. Barnabas encourages people, and he sees in John Mark someone, worth building up. And they get in a fight over it. And I literally, I may have mentioned this, some of you have heard it, but I saw a church split one time over coffee. Over coffee, split. Half the people, took their football and went someplace else. Over coffee. And so here we see Paul and Barnabas, of all people, splitting up this great partnership. They had a job to do, and they get an argument, and neither one of them will relent. This is Paul who gives the advice, if it's causing somebody a problem, just let go of meat. This is the same Paul who, over whether or not to bring John Mark, gets in such a fight that he splits. He could have just said, well, we'll give him a try. But no, if that's not a lesson for us, and if that's not a lesson for how, churches behave, I don't know what is. And so Barnabas takes John Mark, and they run up to Cyprus. And remember, Barnabas is from Cyprus. And Paul chose Silas, and he's one of those two who had come up from Jerusalem. They say come down from Jerusalem when they brought that letter about circumcision. And he goes his own way, and he does what he intended to do. He retraces his old route and goes back to all of these places they've already been to check in on them.
One aside on Silas before we read the next section, and that is Silas is a Roman citizen. Remember, Paul is a Roman citizen, and Silas is a Roman citizen. Barnabas was not a Roman citizen, and that just plays, it's like background information you need for the future, right? Chapter 16, oh, sorry.
What's the point there? I mean, a couple of acts ago, it was diverse. Believers were diverse. You didn't have to be Roman, you didn't have to be Jewish.
What's the point about a Roman citizen?
Yeah.
It's going to become very important in the next chapter. We'll show you why. It ties into something, and Mary's just pointing out it's a good thing to keep in mind. There's also, these things are written like one thing happened, and then next week the next thing happened, and a lot of the time there may be 3 or 4 years in between, and there are.
So this disagreement is not religious disagreement, this is a political disagreement.
No,
it doesn't. The Roman citizen part didn't have, it has to do with what happens in the next chapter. Mary's just pointing that out in advance that it'll trigger when we get there. But is it political about whether to bring John Mark? No. I think what it is what we do to each other. We decide who's worthy. We don't remember Jesus' examples. And here, my only point there is just that it's Paul and Barnabas splitting, but is it political? I guess you could call it political. It really, though, has to do with Paul, in this case, trying to decide. I mean, Paul is so single-minded. He is so single-minded about spreading the gospel, and he doesn't want to get out. These journeys are hard. They go over mountains, they sail and get caught, and they get shipwrecked, and Paul knows it, and he doesn't want this kid who's not dependable with him. And I can look at this and say, I see a lot of myself in that. I
would
tend
say
to.
that Scott would like Paul. Scott would not have liked James at all. You know, when you look at these, but what I love about this study is these were real people, and none of them were perfect. And Paul was single-minded, and that was his
Priority.
That was the thing that made him incredible, and it was also his greatest weakness. It's like any of us. Our greatest strength is often our greatest weakness, and that is Paul. So, Paul came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where he found a disciple named Timothy, a son of a believing Jewish woman and a Greek father. The brothers in Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, so he took him and circumcised him on account of the Jews in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek.
And there you see exactly what I told you. Luke tells us exactly why Paul does this. He does it on account of the Jews in the area and the fact that his father was a Greek, but his mother was a Jew. I mean, he comes out and tells us the reason why.
As they went down from town to town, they delivered the decisions handed down by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So the churches were strengthened in faith and grew daily in numbers. After the Holy Spirit had prevented them from speaking the word in the province of Asia, they traveled through the region of Phrygia and Galatia. And when they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bethany, but the Spirit of Jesus would not permit them. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas.
And this particular little set of verses hangs a lot of people up because they're traveling, they want to go into a region, and it says they were prevented. And people always want to know, how did that happen? How does that work? What are the rules on being prevented? And we're not
I always
told.
want to know, can I be prevented? I mean,
I'm quite certain that I can be. There are times that things, they're looking for God's will. And it's difficult that at times we tend to see every little stumbling roadblock in our way. Oh, that's God speaking to me. Oh, he doesn't want me to do that. Oh, because when it gets hard, it's easy to look for a sign that says, I guess I shouldn't do that. You know, you help somebody out who's homeless, and then you realize that they're also maybe suffering from they could use some counseling, because mental issues often, accompany that. And it begins to get to be a challenge, and something will come up, they don't show up for a few days, and you go, well, I guess that's God telling me that my job is done. And we tend to do that. We tend to jump at those things. Whatever happened, we don't know how they were prevented from going to this area, but they were convinced that they were being spoken to, and God said, no, I don't want you to go over there right now. I want you to go over here. And they were willing to follow, and it becomes, I think, easier when you're really seeking God's will and not looking for what's most comfortable for you.
after the Holy Spirit had
Prevented them.
after the Holy Spirit had prevented them from speaking the word in the province of Asia, they traveled through the region of Phrygia and Galatia, and they came to the border of Mysia and tried, I already read that's right. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man in Macedonia standing and pleading with him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." As soon as Paul had seen the vision, we got ready to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them.
So a vision is sort of a good way to know. You get a direct vision from God. But Paul, after he wanted to turn this direction, that night he gets through a dream, through a vision of a man. And the reason he's Macedonian, they have a peculiar dress. he recognizes it, this man, and he says, in this vision, this man says, come up here and help us. And Paul immediately the next day, now he doesn't just say we're going, he does go talk to his companions and say, hey, look, I had this vision, and they all agree. That's where we're headed next. Macedonia, by the way, was the place where Alexander the Great had been from. It's part of Turkey.
And on verse 10, it says, as soon as Paul had seen the vision, we got ready.
Yep.
So all of a sudden, Luke is with them. Luke has not been with them before. Luke joined the party once they got to Troas.
Yeah, Luke, it's an interesting character. He travels with Paul a lot. He becomes probably his most faithful helper, but he hasn't been. Up until now, he's been talking about, Luke has been saying they, and then suddenly right here at this point, he says we. So Luke has joined them, and they're about to take off for Macedonia.
So there's the four of them. There's Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke.
One other thing, just so those of you who grew up in older denominational churches, there's a song called Send the Light. We have heard the Macedonian call today, send the light, send the light. It's a pretty well-known song, at least in certain circles. This is we've heard the Macedonian call, send us.
For those of us who grew up Catholic, we never heard of that song.
Well, I'll think you can share one.
Sorry. We sailed from Troas straight to Samothrace, and the following day to Neapolis. From there, we went to a Roman colony of Philippi, the leading city of the district of Macedonia, and we stayed there for several days. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate along the river, where it was customary to find a place of prayer. After sitting down, we spoke to the women who had gathered there. Among those listening was a woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth from the city of Thyatira, who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message, and when she and her household had been baptized, she urged us, if you consider me a believer in the Lord, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us.
Again, a lot in a fairly small area. So Philippi is a really important city. One of the most important battles in Roman history was fought right there on the plains outside of Philippi. And after the Romans take over, often they let retired soldiers move into the area. They give them land because it makes the population a whole lot more manageable when they know there are all these retired soldiers living there. So Philippi has a lot of these Greek-speaking locals, but it also has a pretty high Roman population. And they come to town, and it's obvious Paul always goes to the synagogue. And it certainly appears there's no synagogue in Philippi for whatever reason. People want to speculate. But to have what's called a minyan, it's not a synagogue, but you need to have at least 10 Jewish men gather to do some of the functions. And without that, all you can do is get together and pray. It's a prayer group. And often what would happen is the Jews, the synagogues, the meeting places are not welcome in the Roman town, and so they would go outside of town to a river and have their meetings there, essentially a synagogue meeting. But the flowing water is a part of some of the cleanliness rituals. So they go, when it's Sabbath, they go outside of town. We speculate it's because there's not a synagogue, but we don't know. But they go outside of town, and we don't know who all's there. They begin talking with women. These women, it's pretty clear, are what are known as God-fearers. They're out doing a sort of a Jewish Hebrew thing to do on Sabbath morning out at the river. And Paul and his companions began talking to them. Now, that's one way you know that Paul really does embrace getting away from legalism and Judaism, because talking to a woman like this, a Gentile woman, pretty frowned upon. It says that Lydia is a dealer in purple cloth. Purple cloth is more or less reserved for royalty or people who are very wealthy. And so the idea that all women are chattel, that they don't have any rights, this is one of the big signs that we see that's not true. She's a very wealthy woman and somewhat powerful. I think you'd have to say pretty powerful. But she's out here doing this Hebrew function of prayer down at the river, and they talk to them and they share the gospel with them, and it says they believe. And immediately they baptize them. And then Lydia does a thing. She says, I want you to come to my house. This is also fairly recognizable. She's excited and she wants to hear more. Come to my house, eat with me. Well, for good Jews to go into a Gentile house and eat, we've already seen that's a problem. But an apparently unmarried woman going to her house like this would be a shameful thing. And she prevails on them. She says, if you truly consider me a believer, come to my house. And they go, well, we can't argue with that. And they go to Lydia's house. But we see a whole bunch of things have changed in a fairly short period of time. This is behavior that when Paul was still Saul in Jerusalem, he would have never done any of this. So it's Luke is telling us a lot in a fairly short time. It's weird to me to think that there aren't at least 10 Jewish men in a city the size of Philippi, with as much trade as goes through Philippi, that there wouldn't be. And it may be that they're just not devout. They just never got around to making a synagogue. Maybe they don't have a rabbi. They don't have a rebbe to be in charge, and they just sort of skip it. We're just not going to attend. We don't know why. It's hard for me to think. Whatever the reason was, though, they're gathered at the river, and they go back to Lydia's house.
Just one aside, when I went to an all-girls Catholic high school, and lots of nuns taught me, and I remember when I went through there, it seemed to be in favor, and I've read lots of times that they say, Paul is a woman hater. Paul was not a woman hater. I mean,
and one sign is here.
Yeah, one sign is here. I mean, he, obviously respected Lydia and did things that were not in the norm.
Do we know which god Lydia was a believer of?
Yahweh.
Yeah, that we see indications in the way this transpires. Most people agree what Lydia was doing at the river. She was one of those people known as God-fearers. They aren't Jews, but the Jews let them worship with them. And so she's out doing the Jewish thing, but she's not in their minds, not a real Jew. So she's a Gentile, but she worshiped Yahweh.
Verse 16, one day as we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a slave girl with a spirit of divination, who earned a large income for her masters by fortune telling. This girl followed Paul and the rest of us, shouting, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who are proclaiming to you the way of salvation." She continued this for many days. Eventually, Paul grew so aggravated that he turned and said to the spirit, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her." And the spirit left her at that very moment. When the girl's owners saw that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them before the authorities in the marketplace. They brought them to the magistrates and said, "These men are Jews and are throwing our city into turmoil by promoting customs that are unlawful for us Romans to adopt or practice." The crowd joined in attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered that they be stripped and beaten with rods. And after striking them with many blows, they threw them into prison and ordered the jailer to guard them securely. On receiving this order, he placed them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in the stocks.
So the first thing we have to deal with is this woman, and it says she's possessed, oppressed by a spirit, but she has this gift of fortune telling. And, there are going to be people that this will separate. They say, well, it's a scam. And other people who say, no, we really believe that this idea of these spirits inhabiting a person is real. And there's probably no way I can convince anyone, whichever side of the table you fall on. I tend to think that a lot more of this is real because, as I will tell you often, there's a lot more to this place than meets the eye. But these people have taken this girl and they own her, literally own her. This kind of thing was done. And they farm her out. She tells fortunes, she gets paid, they get the money. And they make a lot of money off of her. And she goes around behind them yelling. These are men or servants of the Most High God who have come to you to talk about salvation, which, it seems like she has some knowledge of what they're doing. And it's annoying. Another time, something similar to this, not with the spirit, but it happens to Jesus with a woman up in Tyre and Sidon, following them around, yelling until she gets their attention. And Paul gets so annoyed by this that he turns and instructs this spirit to leave her, and she somehow, they know, has lost the ability to tell fortunes. And these owners are angry because that's their, income. And I can spin this thing for those who think that this is all figurative, that it's not literal. I could spin it in another way, but I'm not going to do that. They lose their gravy train, and they're mad about it. And they seize Paul and Silas and carry them to the magistrates. And what do? Do they say they cast a spirit out of this woman and now she doesn't tell fortunes? No. They say these people are stirring up the population and they're doing things, they're promoting practices that are not legal for us Romans to do. And they take Paul and Silas and beat them. They do canings even today in places like Singapore, and they're horrible. I mean, it's just horrible. It's like getting beaten with a pool stick, cue stick. It's really a bad beating. But you look at this, there's no trial. There's no real evidence except these people. Now, they're probably prominent people in town because they make a lot of money. And on their word, I think it's unlikely that they were even Romans. They're promoting practices that are not legal for us Romans to do. And they probably weren't even Romans. They live in a Roman town. We're going to pull the Romans like, we're going to use them. But they haven't done anything that would be prohibited under Roman law. Nothing. Nothing at all. Nothing. And without a trial, they get beaten and put in jail in stocks. And stocks are these wooden things with holes cut in them. And they put your legs and they clap them down. And because your legs are up off the ground, it's torture. Sitting up, it's like doing a 24-hour sit-up. Because your legs are elevated, you try and sit up, it's just horrible. And it hurts, it's not a good thing. And they stick them in jail.
Yeah, okay.
Are we out of time? No, almost?
Almost. Do you want me to read it on or stop there?
We probably should stop there.
Cliffhanger.
Yeah, a cliffhanger. But what you should recognize is that this looks tremendously similar to what they did to Jesus. They charge him with stuff for mostly stirring up the people, for just causing a commotion, which most of the time is not even illegal, but they're not really even doing that. All they've done is threaten these guys or cost these guys this girl that they own and their money supply. And they go to the magistrates and abuse the system to have them punished. So,
Right before we go, I know we're close. What's wrong with that message? the slave girl is saying. It's right on point.
The slave girl what?
What she was shouting was true.
No, there's nothing wrong with
Right on
it.
point.
I don't know, though, what Paul's problem is exactly. We can only speculate. But it may be that he doesn't like the idea of this spirit being what's proclaiming their presence. It may be that he doesn't want to cause a scene through the middle of town. It may be that he looked at her and we see it as if he's angry, but the idea that she's possessed, he just says, I can't watch this. And he uses his authority and says, I command you to come out. We don't really know. And I find myself speculating. It's bad enough when I do it for myself. It's worse when I come here and say, here's what I think. I better have a good reason. I don't know, Gene. There's nothing wrong with it as such. But there are places where, and we saw this in Isaiah, where it says, people go to these mediums, the mystics, they try and have seances. And Isaiah says, why consult the dead on behalf of the living? Consult the Most High God. And so Paul is probably seeing this my guess is, in light of what Isaiah is saying, that we don't want to be consulting a mystic. We're perfectly capable of telling people what we're here to do, and we don't want it this way.
Except if it's a spiritual thing, it sounds to me like that spirit is conceding. These people are with the Most High God.
So for the people that it makes nervous, the idea that these spirits really exist, nothing's going to help. But we see several times where we're led to believe. In fact, we're told that even Satan himself knows scriptures. The truth, the fact of what they're doing, is not the message of what they're doing. And having this woman who is associated with fortune telling, going through town proclaiming them, my guess is Paul looks at that and says, we are not associated with this. Even if what she's saying is factual, even if it's true, being associated with a circus act or a spirit is not what they're about. That's my best guess.
I think Virginia typed a comment.
Virginia?
Typed a comment. I don't know how to read chat. Here we go.
Chat. Wouldn't consulting a mystic give credence to anything else mystic would present? Yes. Yes. That's sort of what you said it better than I did. But if they appear to be benefiting from and taking advantage of what this woman does, this young woman does, they appear to be endorsing the practice of consulting these spirits, consulting a mystic. And that's a very good point, Virginia. I think that's probably more concrete as the reason why Paul sees this, because they don't want to be seen as endorsing this practice.
Paul is wonderful, and as great as the Lord used him, was still a Jew. He carried that around with him, and you'll see it in some of his letters. He didn't always be 100% completely able to separate his previous life with his current life.
Oh, that's true.
And so we'll see in certain spots where Paul seems to revert back to the law.
And what Malcolm is saying is that Paul remains a Jew, and we see it crop up, and he sometimes falls back into some old patterns. But doesn't that say something for us that you know, if Paul's not perfect, neither are we. And so if someone like him can fall back into those patterns, I think God can still use us, even though we fall back into those patterns.
But he also remains a Roman citizen.
Well, and I was going to mention that. Thanks. Yeah. We're going to see next week. There's our cliffhanger. But we mentioned that Silas and Paul were Roman citizens, and we're going to see in next week's readings why that's important. But Paul remains a Roman citizen, and he doesn't pull it out often. You'll see there are reasons why Paul claims his Roman citizenship. He doesn't carry it around like a badge that says, "Don't mess with me, I'm a Roman." But it figures powerfully in what we're going to see happen next week.
It's time.
God, sometimes we wonder why some of these things are not spelled out for us, and why you don't just say, "This is what I want you to do, this is where I want you to go." And yet we know that at times you do. We feel you, we hear your voice, we recognize your guidance. It's not an easy life for us, and we recognize that, and yet in each of these things we see that we grow, we're strengthened, we see it in the scriptures that you leave. And it's yet another thing we're thankful for. And we ask for anything, God, we ask to open our hearts to that. When we seek, we're told we'll find. Help us to understand how to do that, to seek with our whole hearts, to look for the guidance, to find our way closer to you. Amen.
You guys can unmute yourselves. See if I
We
can-
could have done that with one button last week. It's so frustrating. You gonna stop the recording?
Hi, Jackie. Hi, everybody.
Bye, y'all. Have a good Sunday.